a moment of prayer as we look to God, seeking to commit and to commend today's session into His hands. Bow your heads with me, please. Most gracious and loving Father, we give you praise, we give you glory, we give you honor. We thank you, O God, that you have spared our lives to see a beautiful day, another day that you have so crafted. And so as we embark upon a moment of study of your word and study of nature, science, we pray, oh God, that you will continue to move in our midst as we seek to learn and to seek to defend our faith in better ways. These are our mercies we ask in your Son's name, Jesus, our Lord, and we say, Amen. Okay.
Amen.
Welcome everybody again. I'm really happy to be here. We didn't have any meeting last week, and I think that we would all have taken the time to really rest and to spend some time with our families. This week we have Mr. Bruce Malone again. Welcome, Mr. Malone.
Thank you, Andrew.
For the second time. And he really whet our appetite the first time, so we decided that we're going to have him again. And there is Mr. Malone's bio, for those of you who are so intrigued. I know, especially in the world of apologetics, people often question the presenter's background, educational background, wanting to know if he's or she is so credible to speak. So we have, I'll just read. I don't think I'll go through all of it, but I'll just pick out the main points. Bruce Malone gave his life to Christ over 25 years ago. And this is the most important thing here, him being a Christian, as the Lord miraculously preserved him through a close call with death. Bruce spent over 30 years working as a research leader for the Dow Chemical Corporation, has a degree chemical engineering, and is responsible for key innovations which have resulted in 18 patents. So Mr. Malone is no novice. Since 2008, Bruce has given almost 800 lectures to more than 50,000 people. More than 60,000 books on the scientific credibility of creation have been donated to students and prisoners. Bruce brings science alive through stories and demonstrations, showing that biblical creation is the most rational explanation for the world around us. Bruce resides in Midland with his wife, Robin, and they have 4 children who are actively serving the Lord, and we praise the Lord for that. At this time, I will hand over to Mr. Malone, but before I do so, I'll just do a few housekeeping checks so we can ask questions, pose the questions in the chat, and at the time that is appropriate, we'll take the questions or we'll acknowledge the questions. So over to you, Mr. Malone. Thanks for coming again.
Very good. Thank you. And I'll share the screen, my slides in just a moment. I did realize that biography was written about 3 years ago, before I had done a lot of these overseas trips to public schools in other nations. We've been to 4 nations now, so we've actually given away 250,000 books at this point and spoken to well over 100,000 people, mostly students. And the reason we give books away into prisons is the Lord tells us to visit prisons, and that's my way to do that. They have lots of time on their hands, lots of opportunity to contemplate and think about, what is life all about? Why am I here? So I think that's very important to get the gospel message in front of the folks who are in that situation. So, okay, so let me share the screen. We're going to do the PowerPoint slides. And we also want to share sound and video clips. Okay, that should do it. All right. So can you now see that opening slide?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, now The reason I suggested this topic, I have been speaking and teaching and writing on the evidence for creation for well over 30 years. I've authored and co-authored 8 books on the topic. 4 of them are daily devotionals. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about what I hope is coming together for a trip to Jamaica in February of next year, where with the help of, I believe, the folks who are hosting these talks and others, we can actually get into the public school to do science assemblies that tie history, reality, and science back to God's word. And what has happened in America over the last 2 generations is that the education system has chosen to totally leave out anything dealing with God or any supernatural acts or anything dealing with the Bible of the education of the generations of our nation. And as a result, the belief in God is increasingly becoming irrelevant and antagonistic toward that. So I don't want to see that happen in Jamaica. So that's part of why I would love to come down there, just to help prepare students with the evidence that God's word can be trusted. Now, one of those areas is history. I've talked the last 3 talks basically on science and the evidence from science, biology, geology, cosmology, the laws by which the universe operates, that we can know God exists. But what I often run into, especially when I'm in churches, is that people are influenced by what they've read and heard. And over again, people are told that the Chinese culture is in the range of 10 to 20,000 years old, that very rudimentary, almost cavemen people traveled across the Siberian area and over down the Pacific Northwest and entered North America about 20,000 years ago, that we were eking out an existence during the Ice Age 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, barely human. So that's the filter through which anthropologists and even Christians view history of humanity in the world of the past. And after I left Dow Chemical, and that has been 15 years ago, to teach about the Bible and creation full time, the first book I wrote was called Censored Science. And I kind of created this beautiful full color book where every 2-page spread was one of those evidences from either biology, geology, or astronomy, cosmology that had never been refuted, that confirmed and supported the Bible's view of where everything came from, literal supernatural creation. But people still had this question about, what about all these cultures? If there really has been a flood upon this earth, and the Bible puts it about 4,500 years ago, then all of the cultures of the earth had to have arisen after this flood. The Chinese culture, the Native Americans in North America, the Incas, the Aztecs, the Inuits up in Alaska and Canada, the Aborigines in Australia, all of these people had to have arisen as people spread out from Babel after the flood. But how do you compress all of human history, all of human cultures into a 4,000-year time frame? It doesn't make sense. And I'd never studied it. So I spent about 2 years really studying what were these ancient cultures like, and how do you fit all of this human history into a biblical time frame if the Bible is meant to be understood in a clear, straightforward way? And I believe that's exactly how it's meant to be understood. God is not out to deceive. God is brilliant beyond our comprehension. And to somehow come to the conclusion that he could not have inspired the Bible to be written in a way that would be understood in a clear, straightforward way when the statements are emphatically clear, is just a contradiction of the basis of Christianity, which is God's word. So let's just jump into it. Have we been made in the image of God, and where did all these cultures come from? Now, here's the big 20,000 foot above the landscape view of history, that there really has been a literal creation of mankind. There really has been a rebellion against God, where God uh, basically cursed the entire creation so we wouldn't live forever. The corruption that came into creation because of mankind's sin. There really has been a world covering, total globe restructuring flood that created the rock layers and the fossils about 4,500 years ago, not over millions and even billions of years, the sedimentary rocks. And I talked about that last time. But after that, people spread from a central location. God's command after the flood was to go and fill the world. Mankind immediately rebelled and started to build a tower. And I believe it was a tower of protection in case there was another flood, because we didn't trust God's word. He would never do this again. Now, there have been thousands, hundreds of thousands of floods in known human history. Yet God said there'll never be another flood. So either God is lying, or the flood that's talked about in Genesis is totally different than any other flood that's ever happened since. And that is the case, because that flood restructured this entire planet. And when you deny that flood, you simply misinterpret everything about the past. You misinterpret the age of the cultures. You misinterpret the intelligence of people. You misinterpret the rocks, the fossils, everything about the past, because you've left out the key event that drove the past. And lastly, the most important events of history is when God came as a human being to take that curse of death upon himself. And that is never to be minimized. All of these other things we're talking about are simply to place that in a historical reality perspective. Jesus wasn't just some ancient Jew that has no relevance to us today. He was God who died once and for all for our sins, if we're willing to repent and accept that in place of any payment we could make. Now, little bit of foundation. Just thinking logically, there are only two possible explanations for why human beings exist. One of them is that if people didn't just appear, I mean, one day here on Earth, there were no people, and the next day, there were fully grown, intelligent human beings, Adam and Eve. That's what the Bible says in a very clear way. Now, if that's not true, then where did we come from? The only other possibility is it's something that wasn't a human turned into a human. Since the truth has increasingly been rejected by the world around us, and this goes back 100 years or more, they look around and basically postulated that the closest thing to us seems to be monkeys and apes. So we must have slowly over time, those creatures became more and more intelligent and turned into us. Now, I want to, often Christians laugh at this because they've grown up in churches or they're trained to believe in the Bible, but realize we are in the minority. The vast majority of people throughout educated Western culture are trained to accept this as a fact. And it's not just the museums and internets and textbooks and schools and universities. There's another medium which I think is as powerful and perhaps more powerful in shaping our perception of reality than even education. And that's honestly, it's the movies. Movies are like the pulpit. The Christian pulpit had great influence throughout the millenniums of human existence and the centuries of the church. But movies combine pictures and stories and drama. They touch us on an emotional level. They have music and visual images. It's like the parables that Jesus told on steroids. They're 100 times more powerful, and they help form our perspective of reality, especially when they reinforce what we're hearing elsewhere. Now, I want to show just a little clip. It runs for a little over a minute of what has been called the most influential science fiction film ever made. Now, many people, when they hear that, they'll think of Star Wars, or if you're older of my generation, that there was a series in the 1970s called The Planet of the Apes. The original science fiction film back in the 50s was called The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And it started with this idea of billions of years on the Earth slowly forming. And then there was a leftover link from when we were just ape-like creatures that crawled out of a lagoon. And that was the plot line of the movie. And it strongly used evolution as its vehicle to come promote this science fiction film. But it's none of those. The film that was picked by movie critics that was the most influential was a film made in the 1980s called 2001: A Space Odyssey. And for the first 10 minutes of this movie, there is no talking. It's just portraying a bunch of very brutish, ape-like creatures that are sleeping and fighting and throwing sticks at one another and hanging out in caves. And the kind of the climax of that early introduction of the movie, there's a obvious alien structure that gives one of these ape-like creatures kind of an original thought of how to advance. So I want to show that little clip. If I just kind of watch it along with me. So here, according to 2001: A Space Odyssey and textbooks and museums and internet sites and pretty much all the expert sources of education environment, is our great grandpa. And now there's that alien structure. And grandpa just got an original thought. He's been digging around in the dirt looking for food. And now grandpa's looking at this bone a little bit different. And he's thinking about it. You'll notice the classical music, Beethoven symphony in the background. Ta-da. Grandpa's just thinking about this bone. Now, this human ancestor doesn't usually do much thinking, but all of a sudden, he's looking a little closer. He's thinking, whoa, what happens when I swing this bone and hit another bone? Kind of makes it flip up. And if I swing it a little harder, the whole pile of bones move. And the bones flip up in the air. This is kind of fun. And if I lift this bone way up high and swing it really hard, it's pretty powerful. I could even use this bone. I could crush the skull of this animal. So Grandpa has discovered how to use a tool for the first time in human history. Listen to the drama of the music. So see, it's powerful because it is reinforcing visually the idea that this is reality. Now it's just fantasy. It's some guy dressed up in an ape suit, and the movie goes on. He throws the bone in the air, and we zoom forward 10,000 years, and mankind's in a space vehicle heading off to Jupiter. But that influences people's thinking that we came from apes. Now, if that is true, the further back you go in time, that guarantees the less intelligent people were. Early cultures should have had less ability to build complex structures. Their languages should have been grunts and screams and screeches and hardly anything linked to any sort of written text. Social structure should have been less developed. Inventiveness should have been very rudimentary and much less developed in the earliest cultures of mankind. Now, what all this does is ignore the only other possibility is that we were created. And we were literally created in the very image of the God who made the entire universe. Now, that is what the Bible tells us. And when Christians buy into this fantasy of world history, it's the ultimate rewriting of history. They misinterpret all of history. They misinterpret anthropology. They misinterpret the past. So what we're going to do, we're going to focus on man's knowledge of early biblical events before the flood and his obvious knowledge and inventiveness at the very beginning of human civilizations. Now, The 2-year project to try to figure out how all cultures fit into a biblical timeline, it resulted in this book I've written called Brilliant, Made in the Image of God. You can find it on my website, which is searchforthetruth.net in the market basket. It's on Amazon. I can't remember whether I put all the PDFs on my website or not. There'll certainly be sample pages. But the book walks through history. It has a timeline from a biblical viewpoint of creation until today, with key events of history such as the flood, the Ice Age, the Roman Empire, the cross of Christ, and so on. And then it's got artifacts from all over the world, different cultures, and where those actually fit into a biblical timeline. And it's broken into eras. What was going on Earth for those first 1,600 years before the flood? What was going on for the next 300-400 years after the flood? What was going on from 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, 2,000 to 3,000 to 2,000 years ago? And I'm just going to do about a dozen examples to help see how it all fits together biblically. So we're going to start with that model. What was going on 6,000 to 4,350 years ago? And that's pretty close to where most of the original manuscripts that were used to develop the King James Bible, which I think is still a very accurate translation of early biblical Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, would have put the flood. Well, we can't know because everything was destroyed. The pyramids were not there before the flood. They're made from limestone that formed during the flood, and nothing would have survived this flood. Entire continents were being swept away by tsunami waves, thousands of feet deep, sweeping across entire continents as continental plates were moving and creating tidal wave after tidal wave after tidal wave sweeping across the planet. Nothing survived. And that's what pulverized the rock layers that formed enormously thick layers of sedimentary rock. So the Bible simply says the world was deluged and destroyed, but it is very comprehensive language. It was not some little flood. Now, Noah, you get the feeling, at some point it is said there will be 100 years where he is given to basically prepare humanity for the judgment that is coming. In the book of Hebrews, I believe he's called a preacher of righteousness. So he was out there trying to make a difference, getting people to accept the truth, repent, come back to the Lord. Had they done so, they would have been brought on the ark, but nobody did, only Noah and his family. But Noah was not a stupid man, and he would have brought information and written information on the ark about people's abilities and history of things that happened before the flood, because he knew the whole world was about to be destroyed. So what would he have brought? Well, people lived incredibly long lives before the flood of Noah. Now, I believe the majority of that is genetic. Every generation has more mistakes on their DNA than the one before it. And then the generation after that has those mistakes plus more mistakes. And the next generation has those mistakes plus more mistakes. And at some point, you will reach a tipping point where lifetimes drop off dramatically. As a matter of fact, Adam's son, Seth, overlapped with the life of Noah. So Noah literally and very likely talked in person to the son of the very first human being who ever lived, who walked and talked with God in the Garden of Eden. And all the technology, all the ability, all the genius of mankind to build advanced civilizations before the flood, Noah would have brought some of that information with him. And I believe that's why we will see some of this incredibly advanced civilizations happening so fast. But after the flood was going on, there would have been rapid rebuilding as Noah's sons had sons and daughters who had sons and daughters who had sons and daughters. Remember, early on, there weren't as many genetic mistakes. So it is totally logical that closely related people, brothers, sisters, cousins, could have gotten married without causing genetic diseases and problems. But as more and more mistakes build up in the human genome, by the time we got to Moses, which is about 1,000 years after the flood, God instituted the moral law that close relations should not get married because it would cause problems with their children. And we now know that's an absolute fact. But Noah would have taken documents, he would have had skills, and depending on who had access to this information, you would probably have very advanced civilizations, and you would also have those who were not privy to it, who are just trying to eke out an existence without the knowledge of all this technology. So we would expect to see both in those civilizations following the flood. Now, let me give you an example of how we can know the knowledge of things that happened before the flood aren't just exclusively found in the Bible. And I'll get back to probably how Moses came across the information we find about the Garden of Eden and the events happening before the flood later. I think it's very logical. It's mostly inference, but it's a very logical train of connecting things. But what about the other cultures? You would think if Noah brought information about the Garden of Eden, about the fall of man, about the creation in 6 days, and knowledge of the flood, that ought to show up in those cultures that spread out from Babel, because Noah would have told his sons, those sons would have told their sons, those sons would have told those sons. And as people then spread out after Babel, you would think there'd be some of that knowledge still remaining in more than just the ancient Hebrew culture. Well, there is. That's exactly what we find. And here's one of the most stunning examples. In the 1970s, the Chinese dug up this sculpture in one of the provinces in China. And all the references and that technical information is in that book, Brilliant, I referred to. Now, this is a 12-foot tall bronze casting, a bronze sculpture. It's been cast. And there are branches coming off of a main trunk. And then there are leaves at the end of the branches. I'm using my pointer. And you'll notice these leaves are kind of shaped like a knife. They're curved with kind of a sharp edge and then a blunt edge on the other side. Whoops, let me back off that. Hang on. Okay, this is what those leaves look like, a close-up view. So there's a fruit nested in the middle of the leaf. There's often two or three leaves, like this. Here's a leaf and here's a leaf. There's the fruit. But the leaf is shaped like a knife. It's a knife-shaped leaf with a fruit protected within that knife, which I would just infer is a symbol of a dangerous tree or a forbidden tree. So you have a forbidden tree with a fruit, okay? Now, at the bottom of the tree is this symbol. It is a snake-like creature with his large, long, coiled body coiling up. He looks vicious with teeth bared and flames coming out of his nose. Interestingly enough, this snake has feet, and he seems to be guarding the tree. So we have a forbidden tree with a snake. Anybody catching any similarity going on here yet? And then there is a human hand reaching toward one of the fruit. And that's what that hand looks like, reaching toward a fruit. So it's obviously, 4 fingers and a thumb and fingernails. So you have a human reaching toward a forbidden tree, and there's a snake involved. Now, what is going on here is that as the ancestors of the nation of China migrated to China, and they grew and started to develop their culture, the one thing they wanted everybody who followed them, every descendant of them, to understand was why death and disease exist. Because in an act of rebellion, in a real event that really happened in real history, humanity disobeyed God and reached and grabbed a forbidden fruit when tempted by Satan in the disguise of a snake. And by the way, snakes show up throughout human cultures as gods to be worshipped, because that's what Satan was pretending to be, to bring the knowledge of good and evil and to make us like God, which all turned out to be a lie. So there, the The technology we don't have access to anymore. It's been lost. The documents are long gone in the dustbins of history. But the information of things that happened before the flood shows up in these cultures. Now, while I'm in China, I want to talk about the development of language. The original Chinese language was carved on whale bones, and they were called oracle stones. And it actually was very, very complex. Now, when Mao came to power in 1918 in China, one of the things he did was simplify the Chinese language, but the original language was much more complex than the modern Chinese language. They had symbols for everything. Like in this chart, you'll see there's a very complex symbol that means anger. The next one on this chart, there's a symbol that means diarrhea, meaning you need the third symbol, which is a symbol that means toilet, and on and on and on and on. So in order to read, you literally had to make symbols for each word instead of the letters leading to the word. And here's an example of some of their really early language writing samples. But the language went from incredibly complex to simple. Now that's the opposite of what should have happened if evolution is true. It should have started out simple, but it didn't. It started out complex. The original Chinese language contained 80,000 symbols. Now, we have this thing we do in America, we call it the alphabet song. Often we'll sing it to 1 and 2 year old children at bedtime. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, and there's 26 letters. Well, if the Chinese were going to sing their children to sleep, it would last all night because there's 80,000 independent symbols in order to know how to read the language. But the stunning thing is that these symbols tied, many of them, literally hundreds of them, are tied to original biblical historical events. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. The Chinese symbol for garden is this symbol right here. And it's actually a combination of simpler symbols that are put together to mean garden. Now, if you didn't know any biblical history, that would be pointless. It wouldn't help you memorize the symbol at all. But if you were familiar with biblical reality, it would help you remember the symbol. See, this little upside down T with a extra little cross, that is the symbol for dust. This little square box thing underneath of it right here is the symbol for breath or life. This like K right here is a symbol for 2 people. And the big rectangle that contains it all is the symbol for an enclosure. So dust, given breath to bring it alive, created 2 people inside an enclosure. That is the symbol for a garden. Now that is just stunning. The essence of the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 3, where did people come from? We came from the breath of God. We were created out of dust. There were 2 people originally, and it happened in an enclosure, is a garden. That makes no sense unless the Chinese knew this as a real history, and there it is. And a second example, the Chinese symbol for boat, the very first symbol, this one, means vessel. Often it's a floating vessel or a vessel containing fluid, for carrying fluid. 8 is that symbol. And this again is a symbol for breath or some people being alive. So 8 people on a vessel is the very symbol needed for a boat. Well, where in history did we have 8 people on a floating vessel? There's only one time in all of human history where that's significant, and that would be Noah, his 3 sons, Noah's wife, and his 3 daughter-in-laws. 8 people that came through the flood of Noah. So there it is again, the knowledge of things that really did happen showing up in ancient languages and symbols. Now, again, while we're talking about writing, I'm talking about just the creativity of human beings. We're going to go to Peru, who had no written writing. And we really don't know how far these things called quipuses go back. This is it's an ancient cord, that just like a rope, and there's a bunch of other cord hanging from it. And Europeans, when they come over, the Spanish, they noticed that the Aztecs and Incas would use these to communicate, but they never bothered to write down exactly how to decipher them. So it's a lost language. And I would not be surprised if these go back much further. If they go back 3,000 to 4,000 years, and when the Incas first came, the pre-Incas, the original, very, very intelligent builders of the ancient Peruvian and South American ruins, upon which the Incas later added to, they were probably the ones who developed the quippus. But this is what they look like, and they found hundreds of them. They're featured in all the museums down in Peru. But you'll see the dangling cords. They have different lengths. They have different numbers of knots tied at different positions. They have different even types of rope. So in essence, those are their letters. And there's lots of degrees of freedom. With English, there's 26 letters. And you can rearrange them in an almost infinite number of ways to create words and sentences and paragraphs. Well, they have different lengths chords, different numbers of chords, different size chords, different colors, different number of knots. And those are like their degrees of freedom to create a language. So they would tie these knots and tie these cords and cut them off to different lengths and attach them. Then they would roll it up, stick it in a bamboo pole. Let's see if I have a picture of this. Yeah. Now, this is the Inca kingdom. It was about 3,000 miles from one end to the other, right along the Andes Mountains, which go up 14,000 feet. It's called the Inca Highway. And they would have stations every 10, 20 miles along the way. So a runner could take this quippus, run it to the next station, hand it to another runner. He would run it, hand it to the next one, big relay race. And in a matter of weeks, they could pass a message from one end of the kingdom to the other without any alphabet or any writing. Instead, the guy at the other end would unroll it like we would open a newspaper and read what it had to say. It's an incredibly inventive way to have a language. And it's not rudimentary. It's actually very, very complex. So I just touched on our knowledge of things before the flood. What I really want to jump into is what was going on planet Earth immediately after the flood. In both BC, before the current era or before Christ, and in these actual, how many years ago was this? I put that at the top. But we were struggling for a foothold. There were probably several hundred years that passed before the Tower of Babel. Nobody knows. May have been 200, may have been 400. It's hard to tell. I lean more toward the 200 range. And after this, multiple cultures spread across the earth. There was an ice age raging immediately after the flood. The flood of Noah guaranteed an ice age on this planet. If you take any climate model of what drives the climate of planet Earth, it's ocean water temperature. There was massive volcanism during the flood. We know this because of all the lava that's been formed underwater. There had to have been massive land movement during the flood. So the oceans of the world would have been much warmer after the flood than they are today or they were before the flood. Well, what happens when you have warmer oceans? Lots more evaporation. And that would have come down as snow in the north and south latitudes of the planet. And it would have snowed week after week, month after month, year after year, century after century, because the oceans are so large, they would have taken centuries to cool back down to a new equilibrium level. So probably for a good 500 years or more, ice is building up and building up and building up, and the ocean levels are dropping. It's estimated the entire globe, the Pacific, Atlantic, Arctic, Indian Oceans, they were 200 feet or more lower during the flood. Now, the whole world's in an uproar about global warming and climate change because, some of the polar cap ice might melt and the ocean levels might rise a couple feet. That's nothing. That's minuscule in its implication compared to what truly happened here in Earth history during the flood of Noah. The whole oceans dropped hundreds of feet and over hundreds more years rose back up to their current level. And that, again, is because of the warmer oceans causing a wetter climate worldwide, and lots of geological activity during the flood. So during this period, after people left, what's acknowledged is essentially the first human culture was not some ancient struggling to exist culture. It was the Egyptian culture. The Egyptian, the Chinese, and the Indo-Eurasian, kind of the Indian, Pakistan area, are considered the cradles of human civilization. And they were stunningly brilliant from their very inception. Now, this just flies in the face of this whole idea that we slowly developed from apes. I'm going to give you some examples, but first I've got to tackle, if everybody spread out from Babel, and it was a couple hundred years after the flood. So let's say if the flood was 4,450 years ago, and the Tower of Babel happened at, say, 4,250 years ago. Biblically, Abraham arrived in Egypt, and you'll remember he pretended to be Sarah's brother, and the Pharaoh took Sarah as one of his wives, and God punished that in Egypt. But that's biblically right in the range of 3,900 years ago. How do you have an advanced population in only from 4,250 years ago to 3,900 years ago? That's only 350 years. That doesn't even seem possible. Well, I thought, well, let's just test it. Let's just use some logical assumptions. Mankind would have been highly motivated to have large families after the flood. Noah had 3 sons with daughters, with wives, and they would have a lot of children. When I was growing up, it was very normal, and this is the 1960s. It was routine for many families in my neighborhood to have between 8 and 12 children. Of the kids I played with in my neighborhood, 3 of those families had in that range. There was an 8-member kids, and another one had 10, and another one had 12. And I knew their names and played with those families. The record for a single woman having the most children in her lifetime is one woman has had 69 children, and she died in 1765. So this was documented. Nobody doubts it. Every time she had children, she almost immediately got pregnant. She had lots of triplets and twins for whatever reason. She was pregnant her whole life. She had 69 children. So people can have a lot of children even today. And Wikipedia, and this goes back at least 5 years ago, it documented 50 women who had more than 20 children. And there's hundreds, there's probably thousands over the last few hundred years. So even today, women can have lots of children, and these people would have been highly motivated to have children. Furthermore, they lived longer. Even for those first few generations after the flood, people were living in the 400-year range. And it wasn't until the time of Abraham, people were down to about a 200-year lifespan. And it wasn't until people were, at the time of Moses, about 1,000 years or more after the flood, they were down to about an 80 or 90-year lifetime. So people lived very long. Less genetic mistakes, stronger magnetic field before and for years after the flood, probably less pathogens, lots of reasons for that. So let's just take all that information and think about it. If each of the couples coming off the ark had 20 kids over a 50-year period, and I know they lived longer than that, and they probably had more kids. So it's a very conservative assumption that these people, who are the only people on the entire planet, would have only had 20 kids. Well, that means after 50 years after the ark landed, there would have been the original 8 plus 60 more people. So 68 people on the planet. If they paired up, got married, and each of those had 20 kids over a 50-year period, now 100 years later, there are those 30 couples where each have 20, you would have 600 people. Those pair up into couples. 150 years later, each of them having 20 kids, you have 3,000 couples. 200 years later, you have 30,000 couples, about 66,000 people if the original ones are mostly alive. Well, let's put the Tower of Babel right then. We don't know how many language groups happened. I'm going to pick 70. Linguists like that number, and there's the table of nations in Genesis, names 70 different groups. So let's say 70 groups spread out. One of those groups ended up in Egypt. You would divide 66,000 people by 70. Turns out, or 30,000 couples. Turns out there would be 428 couples in Egypt. Now those couples each have 20 kids. Now we're 4,100 years ago. 50 more years pass, you now have 42,000 couples. 50 more years pass, you have 400,000, 4 million. By the time Abraham arrives in Egypt, we could have had 42 million couples, 80 million people. Now, none of that's illogical. I don't think there were anywhere near that many. I think they were obviously already sinful by the time Babel was going on. There was slavery. Not everybody was getting married. Not every genetic line lasted. All sorts of sin and death and stuff. So, but the point is, there's plenty of time for plenty of people to have been in Egypt. As a matter of fact, world population historically doubles about every 150 years. If you divide the current 8 billion people on the planet by 150 years of doubling, turns out you'd have to double it enough times to account for about 4,500 years. So even the total world population agrees with it starting out right about the time of the Tower of Babel coming off of the ark. Now, let's look at Egypt. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest man-made structure in the world from the moment it was built at the inception of human civilizations. It held the record for the next 3,600 years. Now, I believe it was built about 3,800 years ago, and it wasn't until the 1800s that the Eiffel Tower was built, and it broke the record. Before that, there was no structure taller than that pyramid. And this was at the beginning of civilization. And when we look at this pyramid, it's the earliest pyramid. And the earliest pyramid is the most finely crafted, and it's the most grandiose. It's made of 5 billion pounds of limestone. And actually, it's 2.3 million blocks that were quarried, shaped, moved, and positioned from quarries, some of them up to 500 miles away. Of placing it into this pyramid. It's believed to have been completed within 20 years. If you Google this and you look at what Egyptologists who study Egypt say, they believe it was commissioned when the Pharaoh came to power. He started to build his tomb, and he died 20 years later, and he was buried in it. So they will say this pyramid took 20 years to build. So if you take 2.3 million blocks, simple math, and you divide by 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 60 minutes in an hour, you find out that every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, they had to be placing one of those blocks. And 5 minutes later, another one. 5 minutes later, another one. Day and night, 365 days a year in order to get it built in 20 years. That's an astounding logistical nightmare. How do you keep from even getting in each other's way to have built this structure that fast? And they're huge blocks of stone. Then they covered it with capstones that were like smooth surface that were inset to set inside of the stair step fashion. So the whole surface was just smooth and gleaming, covered with these capstones. Well, these things were 12 foot long, weighed up to 5,000 pounds each. And back in the early 1900s, one of the archaeologists studying at that pyramids went all through Cairo where these stones had been pillaged and used in other buildings, and he measured them, and he found out there was a variation of these stones of less than 1/16 of an inch, which means the underlying blocks had to have been cut perfectly in position to be less than 1/16 of an inch, or the overlying blocks wouldn't have fit. The base upon which the pyramid sits has to be totally level. If it's not, and you're starting to stack the stones, it gets all wobberjaw and out of kilter from one side to the other. So they had to level a 14-acre area of land perfectly level within 0.001 inch per foot. That takes incredible modern technological equipment to do. And they did it at the beginning of civilization. And then they positioned it exactly 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. Now that's a really significant astronomical position called the prime meridian. In order to know it, you have to know the diameter of the Earth, and you have to know where you're at on that diameter of the Earth. And that's where they put the pyramid. They had to have known both. And then they aligned this pyramid with the magnetic field of the Earth to a perfect north-south alignment. And they were able to do it within 2% of a single degree, 0.02 parts of a single degree on the compass. Now, in 1859, we built the Greenwich Observatory in Greenwich, England. It's the premier astronomical observatory of its time in the 1800s. And using all of modern man's technology, knowledge, and ability and instrumentation, we tried to align this building perfectly north-south to the Earth's magnetic field. We got within 0.6%, 6% of 1 degree. The people at the beginning of human civilization were 3 times more accurate than modern man with all of his technology in the 1800s. See, it all flies in the face of the idea that it was some apish creature. Now, that's people who had access to technology that was available before the flood. That's how they were able to do this. At the same time, people have always been prejudiced. I think there were people groups that were being cast out of the mainline human civilizations. There's less left Babel. I think they ended up in the less desirable areas to the north where the Ice Age is raging. And amongst others, those are the Neanderthals. The Aborigines are an example. People who ended up in South America and Lower Africa, I think they lost technology. But let's look at the Neanderthals, because they're synonymous with ignorant ape man. Well, they lived in Ice Age Europe. By the way, they are carbon dated and placed in the 20 to 30,000 year ago range. Now, that is because we make assumptions with carbon dating that there's never been a worldwide flood. So there's always been the same amount of radioactive carbon-14 in the atmosphere as there is today. It discounts and disregards that there would have been way less carbon-14 before the flood and for hundreds of years after the flood as things were reaching a new equilibrium. So even while people like Neanderthals were still alive, they would have started out with way less carbon-14 in the cellular structure, even while they were still alive. So by using the assumption it's always been the same, it's in essence like they would have lost a whole bunch of carbon-14 that should have taken tens of thousands of years because they never had it to begin with. So we come up with a wrong date that's tens of thousands of years off because we're starting with the wrong assumptions that there's never been a worldwide flood. So that's what goes on with those kind of dating methods. But they cared for their elderly. They took valuable artifacts and they buried them with dead people. Why would you do that if you were having trouble even struggling to survive? You're bearing spears and cots and all sorts of valuable clothing because they knew something came after this life. They brought down woolly mammoths, right, with coordinated, highly skilled hunting parties. And they were brilliantly inventive. In the book, I reference a research paper where they basically said that Neanderthals invent super glue because they had this adhesive that was able to bond stone spearheads to wooden shafts so strongly that the wood would snap before the bond would break of an incredibly strong wooden pole. The whole pole would snap before the arrowhead would break away from the wooden bond of the glue. Well, they chemically analyzed it, figured out what sap of what tree it came from, and they also discovered that when it was cross-linked to exactly the right degree at an elevated temperature in absence of oxygen for exactly the right amount of time, it would form an incredibly adhesive structure. But if you heated it too long, it wouldn't happen. If you heated it too high, it would burst into flames. If you didn't keep oxygen away, it would burst into flames. If you didn't heat it long enough or hot enough, it wouldn't cross-link. So it was a very, very complex method of making this glue that was very precise. And they couldn't figure out how Neanderthals could ever have done this. They finally speculated that they buried the adhesive under a rock and built a fire on top of the rock. But even when trying that for month after month, the only way to succeed was to use modern thermocouples and modern technology. So 4,000 years ago, human beings were doing something that we aren't even capable of doing today without relying on previous knowledge and technology from other people. So who's smarter? I mean, these guys were brilliant. They were just living in a very difficult time of history, eking out an existence. And during an ice age, caves are a logical place to live, and that's often where we find their bones. So they're just humans living in a tough area, a variation of us. But they had time to do artwork, gorgeous artwork on the caves walls of these, and they're in France, they're in Italy, they're in South Africa, Australia. We find these cave drawings everywhere. Now, I am probably running over time, so I'm probably gonna have to skip a lot of stuff, but let me just hit a few things that were happening for the next 1,000 years that are pretty stunning. At this point, we're having rapidly advancing languages, diverse cultures, and incredible building projects. Now, remember, this starts only 400 or so years after the flood. That's when the Egyptian culture was really advancing big time. And the Ice Age is just racing and only ending near the end of that 3,000-year time period. Now, here's one of those stunning historical finds that only the Bible can explain. There is no other explanation that makes any sense anybody's ever come up with. This is a map that shows the coastline of Antarctica when it's not covered with ice. So down here is the coastline of Antarctica. This would be the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, depending on where you're at. And it shows all these inlets and in and out features, a very, very detailed look at where the actual land surface is, which is totally covered by miles of ice today. In other words, this is Antarctica. It never warms up down there. So the ice actually will extend hundreds of miles out beyond this land surface. And it's totally frozen ice covering the ocean. And it's a mile or two thick right here where the land is at. And it never melts. So no modern human has ever seen the coastline of Antarctica, but this map shows that coastline. Now, this map was found in 1513, compiled much, much earlier, and it's got notes all along the bottom edge. Now, the possible source of this information, and again, I'm speculating, might have been, amongst other things, the Library of Alexandria that had what's known historically to have had 1 million scrolls of ancient information in books and knowledge, and it was destroyed by a fire about 2,000 years ago. The map itself, based on the information on the footnotes, shows an accurate extent of Antarctica when it's not covered with ice, and it says that this region, Antarctica, had a warm climate. Now, how can that be in known historical times? Well, biblically, here's how it could have happened. Remember, during the Ice Age, it is driven by warm ocean water that had warmed up during the flood. So there would be lots of snow coming down, but if it's falling anywhere near a coastline or near an ocean, it would have immediately melted because the oceans are very warm. It's only further inland that ice would start to build up, way up in Canada, way up in Siberia, way hundreds of miles inland of Antarctica. But along the coastline, it would be coming down as rain because the oceans may have been 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They may have been as warm as the water in Bermuda or Jamaica for hundreds of years after the flood ended. Well, people were exploring this new world. They knew how to build boats. They were very inventive. They're looking for good places to live after Babel, and they would have been documenting what they found. Well, that documentation, the coastline wouldn't have been covered with ice yet for hundreds of years after the flood, could have ended up in its hands of Egyptians and other cultures. Ultimately, those records could have ended up in the Library of Alexandria, and other copies that didn't get destroyed could have ended up in the libraries of other countries. And this was an ancient, I believe, Turkish map found in the nation of Turkey in 1513. So that explains how we could have seen that coastline. It all fits the reality that the Bible is true. But every textbook on Earth history, every museum, every thing you'll hear on the internet will tell you the Ice Age began 200,000 years ago, before mankind even existed. And it didn't end until about 12,000 years ago. And no one has ever seen the coastline of Antarctica, and it's stated as a fact. Well, this map says otherwise. So there's what the coastline's actually 20 miles inland from what you're looking at. But we've now done sonar mapping. The United States Air Force did this in the 60s, and they confirmed that this map shows the actual coastline, which no one since the time of the flood could have ever seen. And then these cultures are doing these amazing building projects. This is from Peru. I've been down here and visited these. Look at these enormous stone jigsaw puzzle walls these ancient people that way preceded the Aztecs and the Incas built. They're carved in this like curved structure that comes to a point and goes across and comes down in another curve and then a different diameter curve, and the other rocks are carved to fit right into those structures. So you can't even fit a sheet of paper or a credit card between them. They're so finely fit. That took a lot of effort, talent, and ability. Some of these weigh up to close to 500,000 pounds, and we still have no idea how they did this, but they did. And this was at the inception of these human cultures. Look at the size of this stone compared to the size of a person. It's been cut, carved, molded, or transformed to this location. And again, the quarries are like up and over a mountain and back down in order to get to this location. And here's a look at more of these ancient structures that preceded the Incas for probably 1,000 years. But the knowledge has been lost. I'm going to jump past this one just because we're running out of time. Jump past this one. This is just elongated skulls and people shown doing brain surgery down in Peru that they found dozens and I think hundreds of skulls that they have cut holes in people's human beings' skulls, and then they have inserted metal and gold plates, and the bones have grown back and fused to the metal. People survived for dozens of years after the brain surgery. This is thousands of years ago. In Greece, one of the national treasures of Greece in the National Science Museum in Athens, Greece, is this stone clay tablet that shows a bunch of symbols. Now, why this is significant is it's the discovery of typesetting. You see, modern typesetting was started by Gutenberg in the 1400s, late in the early 1500s. He invented the printing press. In the year 2000, Time magazine, who every year has the year of the man who makes the most significant contribution to humanity, and it's usually a poor choice. When the calendar flipped the year 2000, they decided let's pull all the historians to see who is the most significant human being in the last 1,000 years, advanced human condition and knowledge and ability more than any other human being in the last 1,000 years. And it wasn't Einstein, it wasn't Darwin, it wasn't Newton, it was Gutenberg who was given that honor because he allowed the transfer of information in mass in such a simple way that the common man could then learn to read and knowledge wouldn't be lost from generation to generation. You could make thousands of copies of the same set of information cheaply just by putting a bunch of little symbols of letters in a tray, covering with ink, and then transferring that information to a sheet of paper. But he didn't invent that concept. In ancient Greece, over 2,500 years earlier, this is estimated to be 3,100 years old, those ancient inventors had made symbols that had meanings. Meanings are attached to the symbols, put them into a circular tray. They were hardened clay. Then they would press soft clay, a little soft clay disc, to copy the impression of those symbols and then harden that disc. So they could make copy after copy after copy of the same information in the same essential process as typesetting, except it's symbols transferred to clay instead of ink transferred to paper. But it's the same concept. It was lost as the little city kingdom after city kingdom of Greece wiped each other out. They happened to find this, later in the 1900s. And basically, it was a rediscovery of typesetting that transformed the world. The technology was lost in time. I'm going to jump past this one. I'm just going to highlight a couple things, even the next 1,000 years. We're aware of this because of biblical times. The Romans owned the known world and ruled with an iron fist, the known world at the time of Jesus. But wherever they took over, they would build these incredibly sophisticated amphitheaters. I found a paper from the University of Houston that studied how come when someone is standing down here on this platform and talking in just a normal tone of voice, like an actor or an orator, people all the way up here at the top can hear it perfectly clearly. And it wasn't just the structure of the amphitheater, it was the spacing and the sizing of the seats and the very material that was being used. It would dampen wind and sound and rustling, and it would accentuate human speech tones. So these things are incredibly well scientifically designed, astounding acoustics. And we just see them everywhere. Here's one at Caesarea, here's one at Ephesus. And these are marvelous engineering structures. And again, those were built over 2,000 years ago. In ancient Iraq, 2,200 years ago, they had batteries. They literally had clay pots with an anode and a cathode filled with an electrolyte solution. And they were coined the Baghdad battery. They would generate between 1 and 2 volts. Mythbusters, a very popular show, showed how you could link them together and you could do electroplating with them and generate a higher voltage, although we still don't know for sure what they were used for. And then the last example is ancient Greece. And by the way, I've only highlighted about 20% of the things in this book I call brilliant, made in the image of God. This was a gear-driven computational device. They found a sea wreck in the Mediterranean Sea back in 1901, and they were after the coins and the pottery, and they just threw this coral-encrusted piece of junk on the shelf, okay, in 1901. Well, in 1971, some researchers found it in one of the museums, wherever it was at, and they thought, it kind of doesn't look just like a wheel. It kind of looks like it's got a gear things inside of it. So they did X-ray analysis, and they found out that there were 82 different fragments that were all working together in a very complex machine type thing. They studied it for the next 30 years. Turns out there were 30 perfectly formed interlocking bronze gears that allowed them to plot the position of planets in the solar system. It's called the Antikytherian mechanism. It's very famous in literature. The report that kind of detailed what it did came out in 2006. This is a quote by Professor Michael Edmonds of Cardiff University up in Canada. He said, "This device is extraordinary, the only thing of its kind. Doesn't mean there aren't others, there probably were. It's the only one we actually have access to. The design is beautiful and its astronomy is exactly right. The way the mechanics are designed makes your jaw drop. Whoever did this, and this is an understatement, not only extremely careful, they were brilliant beyond imagination. In terms of scarcity and historic value, it's more valuable than the Mona Lisa, which is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, here's the reconstruction of what they think it looked like. On one side, it had a handle you could turn, and the little pointer would point to a series of concentric rings on which would be lined up various planets. And on the other side would be positions and times. So you could pick a time, say 10 years in the past, 100 years in the past, 1,000 years in the future, whatever, crank the dial to that time, and the pointers would tell you the position in the sky where you would find Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn, the visible planets in the sky. Now, I don't think, I can't imagine I know anybody who could even begin to develop such a computational computer. And yet people over 2,000 years ago had done so. Demonstrates the accuracy of astronomy, superb metalwork, intricate machine design, all skills not rediscovered for another 1,500 years. So why couldn't they have existed 1,500 years earlier than that? I'm quite likely they did. So I hope that gives you a feel that mankind has always been brilliant. When we find stone tools and rudimentary things and ancient people eking out of existence, those were the people shoved to the fringes of human civilization, where they were starved to death and isolated and persecuted and inbred for generation after generation. I suspect their very bodies started to deteriorate. So these ape-man creatures we see are not mankind's ancestors. They are the deteriorated degeneration of mankind who was left out of the mainstream of human activity. And all of the Stone Age leading to the Bronze Age, leading to the Iron Age, leading to the Modern Age, is just a fanciful construct in which to put things to maintain the belief in evolution without God. And this kind of evidence shows that it can't be true. And when we leave God out, everything becomes relative. Morality degenerates, life becomes cheapened, slavery results, deception runs amok. The most convincing, the most conniving, the most evil rises to the top, and every society falls apart. And that is the history of this planet. And that's why God's word is so important. That's why we've got to take it seriously and use it as our plumb line for truth and morality. Because whenever we don't, and whenever we leave its history out, it weakens the belief in the Bible. Everything degenerates. So that's where I want to end. We'll leave time for questions. I hope you all found that interesting. And I'll throw it back to our moderator for questions. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right.
Okay. I'm seeing a few questions in the chat. So firstly, there's a question from SB. This person is saying, or asking rather, interesting, but a question. Some would say the age of the earth is a side issue. To what extent would you say not believing in evolutionary time frames is important in enabling evangelism?
Well, let me ask you this. I'm going to answer the question of the question, because God could have used millions and billions of years to make things. There could have been a slow, gradual process of things. Is trusting what God says repeatedly and clearly a side issue in the Bible? If God says something crystal clear and he repeats it over and over again, and we choose to disregard it and assume it's not true, do you think that has any implications on people trusting other things the Bible has to say? I guess it's a rhetorical question, because anybody who has any reasonable expectation for believing a nonfiction book is something that should be believed or understood, and then the clear testable, straightforward statements are disregarded and assumed to be wrong, they lose credibility in that book. And ultimately, they lose credibility in everything else it has to say. So the Bible is very, very clear that mankind was created recently and fully formed. Now that is diametrically the opposite of what evolution tells us. And let me just give you a couple examples. 10 times God said he created creatures to reproduce after their own kind. And he said he did it in a matter of days. And that's repeated over and over again in the first book of Genesis. And every single time the word yom, which means day, is used with a number, day 1, day 2, morning, evening. And there's hundreds of examples in the Old Testament. Every single time it means a normal day. And the only place it's doubted is in the book of Genesis, because we've been trained by the world to think in terms of huge periods of time. Jesus, when asked about marriage, said, have you not read at the beginning of creation, God made male and female human beings? Now, was Jesus God or not? And how could 14 or so billion years after the beginning of creation and human beings being made or evolving, how could that be called the beginning of creation by the one who made it all? See, it doesn't make sense. The Bible can't mean what it says, but it's very clear what it says. In the 10 Commandments, God said, in 6 days, I made the heavens and the earth and all that they contain. So that's the stars, that's the space, that's the time, matter, the energy, the universe, that's the animals, that's the plants, that's the people in 6 normal days. That's what it says. So and furthermore, the Bible talks more about a worldwide flood than it does the creation of the whole earth. It spends 3 chapters of Genesis talking about that, and it comes up in Proverbs and Psalms and the prophets and the book of Hebrews, and Jesus himself talks about the flood, and the book of Peter talks about the flood. And it says in the account of the flood, every hill under heaven on earth was covered by water. That has enormous geological implications, and it would have created all the rock layers and all the dead animals and all the fossils rapidly and recently, which means the billions of years can't be true. And if the billions of years are true, then that flood couldn't have happened. So the question has the kind of tone, well, the age doesn't matter. We should just accept what the world has to say and concentrate on the gospel. But what you're really saying is, don't trust the Bible when it talks about biology. Don't trust the Bible when it talks about geology. Don't trust the Bible when it talks about world history. Don't trust the Bible when Jesus makes statements and God writes the 10 Commandments. But now you have to trust it when it talks about salvation. Is that really going to work? I don't think so. This is a very, very important issue, and it is very, very clear. And there's lots of evidence scientifically that things aren't as old as we're told. They're just not commonly known and ignored by the world. So both scientifically and biblically, we should trust what God has told us and not pretend it doesn't matter. But one last thought, because this is an important issue. Jesus made this statement to the Pharisees. He said, this is to Nicodemus, okay? This is John 3:12, right before John 3:16. Jesus said, if you don't believe me when I tell you of worldly things, how will you believe me when I tell you of heavenly things? In other words, if we can't believe the Bible when it talks about physical stuff, the physical world and history, how are we going to believe it when it tells us about spiritual stuff? And that's exactly why Christianity is crumbling in culture after culture, because we've quit believing it when it talks about the stuff we can see, touch, hear, and feel. But it is true, and it is important.
Okay. Let me go on to the other question. Other than archaeology, are there any biological evidences of human beings substantially different or being different from apes in their origin?
Oh my goodness. Genetically, there is a gap from here to the moon between us and apes. For decades, it was just repeated over and over and over and over and over again that we are 98 or 99% identical to apes, our DNA code. Well, it's only been in the last 10 years that we've that we've totally decoded the DNA of apes and we've totally decoded the DNA of humans. And they're both about 3 billion letters long. If it was a book, it would just be letter followed by letter followed by letter. And that's what it is. The DNA is a code. The codes are only written by code makers. It's like it's a language, and languages only come from intelligence. And there is at least, if you just lined up letter after letter of the ape versus a human, there's at least, and some people say as much as 20%, somewhere between 10 and 20% difference. Well, that means if it's 3 billion letters long, there are 300 million differences between apes and humans in the coded information. That is an astounding amount of information. And all of that 300 million letters is just completely missing from apes, and it's completely new in humans. You can't even explain how hundreds or thousands of changes could totally disappear and totally reappear in humans as new, different, useful information. So we know it was designed. And archaeologically, there are lots of variations of human beings. I mean, just in the nation of Congo, we have a race of people living there where the average height is just over 4 foot tall. And there's another race of people in that same jungle region of Africa where the average height is about 6.5 foot tall. We have people with much more sloped foreheads than others. We have people with huge wide noses, different shaped faces, different skull capacities. One of the leading scientists of the 1700s, they thought this man was so brilliant that when he died, they decided to test his brain capacity. It was only about 900 cc's. The average human brain capacity is 1,600 cc's. So size of brain has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just variations of the human family. And I think there was even more variation in the past. Most of the characteristics of Neanderthals, the very thick ridges along the forehead, the more sloped forehead, a very, very large, massive bone structure, that's probably just a genetic variation of human beings that died out eventually and is no longer in existence today for the most part. The same thing is true of apes. There are apes that have went extinct. Their characteristics are no longer alive. There are probably some that stood more upright, some that had larger skulls, some that didn't. Some apes use tools even to this day. Some don't. So what's going on is we find variations of humans in the rock record. We find variations of apes in the rock record. And whenever we find anything that's a little bit different than modern, we just line them up and assume that one slowly turned into another. But nobody has ever come close to explaining how that could happen or where all that information came from. And it's all just speculation. And as I mentioned, some of those sort of in between ape and human kind of structures, I think they're more likely degeneration of humans who have inbred generation after generation after generation, and they're malnourished and starved in insulated situations. And biologically, you can Google this and go to biological sources. There is a phenomenon called insular dwarfism. It comes from the word insulated, and dwarfism means to drive things smaller. And if you take any mammal type organism, and this has been shown to happen with elephants, and you isolate that species in a certain area where there's a limited number of resources, the brain uses up to 30% of oxygen and nutrition of any mammal type organism, including human beings. It's a huge consumer of oxygen and nutrition, of nutrition. So if the organism living in a very starving location has a smaller brain, they literally have an advantage. They're more likely to survive because they need less calories. So you do that generation after generation after generation, that species will tend to develop smaller and smaller and smaller brains. Doesn't mean they're no longer part of that species. It may or may not affect their intelligence, but it explains how fully functional human beings, inbreeding over and over and over again with generations that develop all sorts of other problems and being starved for nutrition, could develop much smaller brains. And then when we find their bones, we just assume it's an ape in the process of turning into a human being when it's just a human being that's degenerating into a smaller human being. So I think that's the best explanation for some of these skulls that are popularly presented as apes in the process of turning to human beings.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question. If primitive humans were so brilliant, why did they live in caves rather than build their own houses?
Well, let me just, again, I'm going to throw out a thought process. Suppose that you are a big, brutish, ugly guy, okay? And you can't find a girl she didn't want to pick you because you're kind of out there. There's not all that many human beings on Earth, and there's an ice age going on, okay? So you are being discriminated against and persecuted and not given good housing. So you have to move to the outskirts of society, to the kind of the worst place to live, and you haven't been given a lot of technology. And then your children have even less access to it, and your grandchildren have even less access to it. And meanwhile, the Earth's climate is getting worse and worse. The ice in the cold areas are spreading. Not a lot of trees to cut down. You know, your children's children, they haven't been taught how to make structures and buildings. Doesn't mean they're stupid. They just don't have access to technology. Suppose you were picked up and dropped in the middle of Africa, not having been taught any survival skills. And in the midst of the jungle setting and being eaten by insects and all sorts of predatory animals, you found a cave structure in a hillside. I think you would very rapidly make that your home. Well, and then you have children and they may continue to live there. So I think it's very, very logical that some humans kept as highly guarded secrets technological advancements that they knew about before the flood. The Chinese, the Egyptians, the Greeks, other ancient cultures. And there are other people who were pushed to the fringes of civilization into Africa, up into the Ice Age environments, over in Australia, and they didn't have access to that technology. So they survived however they could. And it's pretty tough. I just want you to think about it, the person who asked this question. If you are suddenly, the world is destroyed and you're thrown in the middle of a wilderness, I think for a while, and maybe for many generations, you may be eking out an existence as a pretty primitive person. That doesn't mean you're stupid. And that's what we find. We find some humans from history that are just barely eking out an existence with primitive tools. And at the same time of history, we find other humans that are brilliantly inventive and building, advanced civilizations.
I think that your response somewhat covers or answers the other question that was asked. And I'll just read it. It says, if primitive man were so knowledgeable, why did they use stones rather than make them out of iron and bronze?
Same answer. They didn't have access to it.
Yeah.
Let me ask that person who asked that, if you were thrown in the middle of a jungle, could you go learn how to make iron? Do you think you could make iron? I don't think I could. I don't think I could identify the rock I would need. I don't think I would have the technology. So what are you going to do? You're going to use what you find. You're going to make it. You're going to find a stone and attach it to a pole and start pounding out grain or killing animals or doing whatever you can.
Okay. Another question. If primitive man were such good communicators, why is it that they had no highly developed language, but communicated by signs or by drawings or by grunts?
Same answer. While some humans were having very rudimentary attaching symbols to meaning. And by the way, I think it's interesting that from the get-go, every culture was doing some sort of symbolic attachment of some sort of symbols for a language. No animal does that. That's a purely human activity. While the Chinese were the earliest civilization, they had 80,000 symbols. This was not a rudimentary language. The Egyptians, the earliest cradle of civilization, they had an advanced pictorial language, and it wasn't actually translated until the Rosetta Stone was found in the 1800s. So for you to even ask the question means you don't really understand how advanced these early civilization languages really were, and they were very advanced. And just because there were other civilizations that didn't have as advanced of a language, that's purely a matter of, if you're struggling to get food and feed your family, your primary goal isn't to develop a language. You're going to do very little in that area. And that could go on for generation after generation.
I think you already answered this question when you made reference to the DNA, but I'll just read it. It says, are we really 98% similar to chimps in DNA?
No, we are just think about this. There are hundreds of millions of differences. 10% doesn't sound like much, but 10% of 300 billion is 300 million differences. We're not even remotely close. The fact that we're even 90% similar is because God chose to have us all breathe the same atmosphere, eat the same sort of foods, have the same sort of useful structure of fingers so that we can use them well. We have the same organs that have been proven to work well across the mammal kingdom, but we are not an animal. God made that very, very clear. 4 times. And by the way, ancient Hebrew, when it wants to emphasize the importance of something, it doesn't like stop and say, this is really important. It just repeats it a second time. That means what has been said is really important. It does it in 4 times. Pull out your Bible, go to the very last 4 or 5 verses of Genesis chapter 1. And you'll see that 4 times after God made everything else, he finally he makes mankind. And he said he breathed the very life into us. And 4 times he tells us he made us in his image. That is not said of any other animal. It is incredibly important. It's important in understanding the character of God. It's important in understanding how much we are loved by God. And it's important to get rid of this nonsense idea that we're just some sort of an ape that slowly turned into a human being. That is absurd from a genetic viewpoint, from a biological viewpoint, and from a paleontological, looking at the bones with an honest look viewpoint. That has never happened. God literally supernaturally formed mankind, and then he spiritually and physically made us very different than any other animal.
Yeah. Okay. Other question. Is there evidence that there was only one ice age rather than 8 ice ages 100,000 years apart? And do you have any links for further reading?
I would go to ICR.org. That's the Institute for Creation Research, and it might be .com, or answersingenesis.org, or CM or creation.org, and it might be .com. Okay, so it's either Creation, ICR, or Answers in Genesis. Just Google those. There are, all of them have search engines for technical research papers. All of them have meteorologists and earth scientists who have studied the ice age and studied the ice cores. And there is lots of evidence that all of that ice built up rapidly, and it's been misinterpreted as multiple ice ages. Now, what they'll do, they'll dig a core, and some of these ice cores go down 1 mile and 2 miles. So they'll like grab a cylinder that shows all of these different rings. So you'll have a compacted area of ice, and then you'll have a discoloration or a more compacted area of ice. And then you'll have another section, another ring, another section, another ring, and you'll sometimes find 100,000 different rings. And some of them are very wide, and you'll see meteorological or ash differences or oxygen content differences in these different rings. And it all gets interpreted. It's all a matter of interpretation. The data doesn't tell us there's been multiple ice ages. That is a belief too. It's not a fact of science, it's a belief. And it's interpreted that these rings build up slowly. And when there's major changes, it's because it was a different ice age, or there's this major section of a lot of melting, and then there's another bunch of rings after that. Well, that must be a different ice age. Or you'll find a ridge of rubble that glaciers have shoved along, and they're just grinding away at the earth, and they'll just build a ridge of rubble that might go hundreds of miles along a land surface. And then further along, 100 miles from that, there's another ridge of rubble. So it's assumed that's been two different ice ages. Again, what do we see? We see a ridge of rubble. That doesn't prove there's been multiple ice ages. What was happening was that during the one and only ice age, you would have enormous snowstorms where you might have 100 feet of snow coming continuously, and then there might be a break, or there might be a summer winter season, and then you would get a hardened ring form, and then there'd be lots more snow, and it would build up mile thick layers of ice during the ice age, and some of it never melted. Once it turned, just stayed cold, and the ocean cooled down and the evaporation slowed down. So we've got those two models. See, neither one is proof. They're both models. There's a model that the flood caused a warmer ocean, caused more evaporation, caused the ice age. And there's a model that you have enormous periods of time on the earth, and that these huge thick layers of ice are the result of multiple ice ages. Well, it's just as good of an explanation that it was the advancing and retreating over hundreds of years period that created those ridges of rubble, and not just multiple events separated by hundreds of thousands of years. See, it's all assumption. It's all belief system based on whether you believe in the time frame or not, and whether you believe in the Bible or not. Now, here's an example that tells me what's really going on. And you'll find this in my various books, and you can find it on the literature. Google the Lost Squadron of World War II, or the P-38 buried airplanes. In 1945, there was a squadron of P-38s that were being flown over to Europe to join the war effort, and they were flying across Greenland, and they were forced to land during a snowstorm as they were heading toward Iceland from Greenland. And they got out of their planes, abandoned their airplanes, made it back to the military base, but they left those airplanes there in 1945. Well, in 1975, 30 years later, there were some businessmen that were millionaires from Tennessee, and Time magazine featured this story, and it caught my attention way back in 1990 when it came out. And they decided to go dig up one of these airplanes that had been caught in a snowstorm in Greenland. They thought they could just dust the snow off the wings and fly one of those airplanes home. Well, it took them 10 years, from I think 1972 to 1982. And it cost them millions of dollars to just get one of those airplanes out of the ice. Because from 1945 till 1975, those airplanes were now buried under 200 feet of ice in Greenland. So in just 30 years, 200 feet of ice formed over top of those airplanes. Now, it takes about 10 inches of snow to make 1 inch of ice. That's a rule of thumb. So if they're under 200 feet of snow, of ice, that means that area of Greenland had more than 2,000 feet of snow in just 30 years. And that's when there's not an ice age going on. So when you look at something like that, and that's modern documented history. 200 feet of ice can now form in Greenland when we don't even have an ice age. That tells me that those huge thick layers of ice couldn't have taken hundreds of thousands of years. They formed much more rapidly and much more recently. So that's evidence that supports my viewpoint. And it's not just my viewpoint, it's many, many others who trust the Bible to be an accurate record of history. And therefore it has very, very strong implications about everything from the age of the earth to the development of life to how the ice age fits in and how old things are. So no, go study it. Go to these search engines, type in ice age, look at the evidence for yourself, because you're not going to read about it in museums and textbooks. because evolution has to have huge periods of time. So they're never going to present any evidence that contradicts that belief system.
Okay. I think this is the last question. When you spoke about fringe civilizations, are you saying that ape-men existed in any form?
I'm not sure I understand the question. By fringe, I mean civilizations that did not have the technology of other civilizations close to them. Civilizations that were, the world's still filled with what we call primitive civilizations, in the Amazon River region, in the outback of Australia, deep in the jungles of Africa. There are still civilizations that I would call fringe civilizations. They have lost technology of the modern world around them that was developing. Now that doesn't mean they're stupid. They're very skilled in their environment, but they're using rudimentary tools to do so. So it's not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of technology that has been lost.
Okay. The concept to me, it sounds like living in a vacuum, basically, disconnected from.
Basically, and I hope people can understand how difficult it would be for any of us to survive if suddenly all of our modern technology was removed from us, and we were just plopped down in the middle of a wilderness. We would for a long time, I think, be living in a very primitive way.
Okay. And is that primitive relative or absolute?
Well, as I said, primitive isn't a measure of intelligence. Primitive is a measure of your access to technology.
Okay. All right. I think that's all the questions.
All right.
Well, we just want to thank you, Mr. Malone, for taking time again.
You're welcome.
Scheduled to accommodate presenting and enlightening us.
Yeah, and I hope to come to your country and visit and share in the schools come February of next year.
We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes.
You have a blessed evening.
You too.
And thanks for everybody who joined in with the great questions.
Yes.
Thank you as well. We appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. All right.
Okay,
And is that Sarah? Are you online?
Yes, I'm here.
We do need to talk. There's a lots of prep to be done. And the most important thing being getting books down there that we can then give to students. Are you available Monday for a Zoom meeting or?
I'll email you right after this.
Email. Find a time. Yeah, find a time in the next 3 days. I'm going to be gone for a whole week after that.
Okay.
That we can talk. And
right.
start to make plans.
Right. Yeah, looking forward very much. I really also enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much.
You are welcome. I enjoyed giving it. So have a blessed evening. Thanks for having me.
Yes.
All right. Same to you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. All right, everyone. Bye.